About the Bible, what does the Bible say? And this is more of a talk for those of you who believe the Bible than for those of you who don't, or those of you who say I can't believe the Bible because everything it says is wrong. It's just not true. Just to give you, for those of you who go to church and know the buzzwords, I believe the Bible is God's inspired, inerrant word. I would have what we call a high view of the Bible. It's based on my review of it. If the Bible is true, then when it talks about archaeology or things that have happened in history, there should be archaeological evidence for those things, and there is. In fact, the Bible has this long history of skeptics saying, well, the Bible's not true because it talks about fill in the blank historically, and we've never seen any historical evidence for that. And then sometime later, we'll find historical evidence and you'll scratch that one off. So there'll be a new blank. I mean, it's happened with the existence of Pilate and Solomon. Up until 15 years ago, the skeptics said, well, the Bible's not true because it talks about a King David and there's no archaeological evidence for David. Well, in the last 15 years, we found 2 clay tablets that talk about the kingdom of David, that he really existed. So now those who are skeptical of the Bible say, well, yeah, okay, so David did exist, but his kingdom wasn't as big as what the Bible says it was. You know, they keep moving the goalposts. So anyway, through study of archaeology, I've come to believe that the Bible, and other things, I've come to believe the Bible is true. So I believe you can take the Bible at its face value in what it says. And so therefore, for those of you who believe that, we're on common ground. Now, I want to ask 3 questions. Did God create the universe? Did the Big Bang happen? And does macroevolution happen? Macroevolution is, of course, the idea that all species come from a common ancestor through natural processes. And I got 4 views up here. I call young Earth creation. I call the second one old Earth or progressive creation. I call the third one theistic evolution. I call the last one naturalistic evolution. So young Earth creationists believe that God created the universe, that the Big Bang never happened, and there's no macroevolution. This idea, this idea as the one true belief in the Bible is relatively new. The idea that this is what the Bible teaches and there's no alternative was developed in the 1930s as kind of a rebellion against evolutionary teaching. If you go throughout history and you read what scholars talk about, they don't know when the universe was created. But when evolution began to gain a foothold in the culture, the fundamentalists of the early 20th century tried to develop an argument against evolution, and this is what became then foundational to certain Christian beliefs. And most of the Christians I run into in the U.S. have this belief. But there's other beliefs. Old Earth or progressive creation say yes, God created. They say yes, the Big Bang happened, but macroevolution didn't happen. So this belief would say the universe is 14 billion years old, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, life is 4 billion years old on the Earth, but when you see new life in the fossil record, the Cambrian explosion, the development of mammals, that is not a product of evolution, but a product of God creating. Theistic evolutionists say God created, that the Big Bang happened, and that God used evolution somehow to make humans. And naturalistic evolution says there is no God, but the Big Bang and evolution happened. Okay? So the biggest difference in all these views is right here, right? This is the only one that says there is no God, naturalistic evolution. And if I was to draw a line here to separate this, I can make a strong argument that any of these 3 views could be supported by the Bible. So we had someone on the comment cards last night say, why would you talk about something that's not biblical? Because the person felt the Big Bang was not biblical. So they would fall into this category. But I would argue very strongly that any of these 3 views could be supported by the Bible. In fact, I have my preference as to what the Bible most likely is saying. But I don't know, because there are places somebody brought up that the Bible is ambiguous. And so in the age of the earth, it's ambiguous. In the method God used to create humans, it's somewhat ambiguous. And so I've been studying this question I don't have all the answers, but I'm studying the question easily now for 35 years. And so I've read a lot, I've spoken a lot, and so that's kind of what I wanted to present and open it up to questions, and I'm sure your questions will precipitate, at times, lengthy answers. Okay. So let's go back to your question. Why would God write an ambiguous record of the creation? So let me pose a question to you. Here's your job. I want you to write a one-page summary of the creation of the universe that will speak to all people in all times and all cultures and speak to them in a way that they recognize and is accurate. That's your job. You're not going to find a much better answer to that question than Genesis 1. But to do that, there has to be some level of ambiguity. You cannot have talked to the ancient Hebrews about a 14 billion-year-old universe and a Big Bang. It just would not have been something within their beginning realm of thought. So you would have to have written a treatise, a short summary of creation that can speak to all people in all times and all cultures and be true in all those different settings. And if that's your job, you can't do much better than Genesis 1. But the only way to do it is to have some ambiguity. And that's why I think it's somewhat ambiguous. Yeah?
I believe theistic evolution, the only roadblock that I run into with evolution is who are Adam and Eve, and what's the Garden of Eden, just that whole story in general. Where does that come from, and how can you interpret it?
So, depending on where you are in this realm, you will deal differently with Adam and Eve. You could deal with Adam and Eve the same way in all three columns. So let's start with that. So Adam and Eve, regardless of what column you're in, could be literal people, they could be the first two humans, and they could be the genetic ancestors of all of us. That could be true in any of those three columns. If you're in one of these two columns, then those two people, Adam and Eve, would have lived somewhere between about 60 and 100,000 years ago. If you're in this column, they only lived 6,000 years ago. But it's certainly possible that Adam and Eve are the first two actual humans. So if you're theistic evolution, in fact, C.S. Lewis wrote one possibility in his book, The Problem of Pain. And in The Problem of Pain, he wrote the possibility that God used evolution to create human bodies. Not us, our spirits. Our spirits are separate. They're a part of us that is unique to all the animal kingdom. We share a lot with the rest of the animal kingdom. We don't share a spirit with them. That's the part that communes with God. So it's possible that God used a physical process, evolution, to create Adam and Eve's bodies. He breathed in them the breath of life and made them spiritual beings. That's what it means to make them alive. And he placed them in a literal garden. And you could believe that in any one of these three views, that they're literal people, the first literal genetic people that we're all descendants of, that they lived in the actual Garden of Eden, and just when that would be would separate. There are other possibilities that keep Adam and Eve to be actual people, maybe not the genetic ancestor of us all. And a lot of theistic evolutionists would hold to this other view, that Adam and Eve are literal people, but maybe not the genetic ancestor of us all. I have more problems with that from a biblical point of view. So, any follow-up questions? Because that, I mean, I could go into lots more detail, but that's kind of the overview.
No, I mean, your own conclusions can be drawn from what you just said, so it kind of is a preference type thing. What's the name of that book, though? The C.S. Lewis book?
That was The Problem of Pain. It's really just a footnote in one chapter. Okay. So a great theistic evolutionist of today is Francis Collins, the guy who sequenced the first human genome. He's got an organization called BioLogos. If you go to biologos.org, probably the best organization for older creation is an organization called Reasons to Believe, reasons.org. I really have problems recommending anything in Young Earth because most of what I read on their websites, unfortunately, is easily falsifiable. Probably the best one is the Creation Research Institute. And again, I will lay my cards on the table and I don't fall into this. Well, you know from last night, I talked about the Big Bang. I don't fall into this camp. This is how I grew up. is what I was taught was true in the Bible as I grew up. The more I studied both the Bible and science on my own, the less I believe this, and I don't. And I think most of the supposed evidence for this column is pretty easily falsifiable. Now, if this is where you live, that's fine. The pastor of my church lives here. Some of my best friends live here. I may be wrong. This may be true. And so, but I had trouble supporting it. Let's just put it that way.
Since we are discussing that, I wanted to mention that, okay, you said that that column arose in 1930s. Have you heard of Bishop of Usher?
No, I didn't say it arose in 1930. I said it became dogmatically the truth in 1930. Before that, it was one option. And in fact, even Bishop Usher, who came up with the 4004 BC date, he knew he was, last night the question came up and I said, you have to make the assumption that the genealogy is being complete and the days being 24 hours. Usher was kind of playing a game. There was a game among bishops back then to try to be the best one to guess when creation was. But they knew it was a game. They knew they were making those assumptions. Some of them took it seriously, some didn't. And so, you know, I'm not saying that that idea only came around in 1930. Because you could, for 2,000 years, you could have taken the genealogies in 6 days and come up with a date. The idea that this is the one and only biblical idea was institutionalized in about 1937 or so, with the fundamentalists who were Seventh-day Adventists, basically. And that's just history. You can go look that up. So that's what I mean. Okay. Most of us fall into this because of what happened in the early 20th century, because of a shift in thinking among evangelical Christians, that this became the institutionalized view. Okay. Yeah.
I read a book a number of years ago that time is relative and that gravity affects time. And his argument was, agree with the young earth person, that if you're a certain place in the universe when it was created, and I think it was gravitational pull slows it down or speeds it up, I can't remember which one it is, but that would explain the billions of light years away. As
this is really popularized by a Jewish physicist named Gerald Schroeder, and I forget the book he wrote. The Presbyterian Church of America about 25 years ago wrote a treatise on this very thing. And they talked about 12 different interpretations of the days of Genesis and what they might mean, and they included that one. So in this idea, the days are 6 24-hour days from one perspective, but from another perspective, there's 13.8, 14 billion years. And again, I think, as I said last night, that the best understanding of the days of Genesis is a period of time for each one. But there are lots of possibilities. There is an ambiguity. You cannot say for certain. When I read the best Hebrew scholars, what they consistently say is that they don't believe the days are 24 hours. They don't always say what they do believe the days are. Like Gleason Archer says what he doesn't believe the days are. He doesn't say definitively what he thinks they really are. But the point is that the best scholars of ancient Hebrew agree that it's uncertain from the context what they mean. Where if you read it in English, you get people say, look, it's really clear, it's 24 hours. But it's not so clear in ancient Hebrew. By the way, ancient Hebrew, in which the original Genesis was written in, has about 3,000 words. English has about 1 million words. And so if you wanted to say God created in 6 periods of time, there's only one Hebrew word to use, and it's the same word that we translate days, the Hebrew word yom. So where I could say God created the earth in 6 days, or 6 epochs, or 6 eras, if I'm writing in ancient Hebrew, the way I would express all those 3 thoughts are with exactly the same word, 6 yoms. And so and this is what, again, what I think is supposed to be that way. It was written in a culture where you could not differentiate with a word between epoch and 24-hour day, and I think purposely, because that's what God wanted. He wanted that ambiguity in the word. And so if the writer meant 6 periods of time, he has written it exactly the best way he can using the language he has. I once had a pastor say to me, well, it couldn't be more clear if he meant 6 24-hour days. And I said, it couldn't be more clear if he meant 6 epochs, given the language he had. And so I think that's the bottom line. We don't know, so you have to look other places to determine. It's not in the Bible. Schofield in his 1907 or 1912 Bible writes, the Bible gives no indication for when the universe was created. And I think in 21st century American churches, we tend to preach the Bible does give an indication when the universe was created. And my message would be, I don't think that's true. I think the best scholars of ancient Hebrew would tell you the Bible does not give any indication when the universe was created.
So, I mean, but is that true that time is?
Yes, that's true. So that might be the answer. The reason I have that, my brother is a biblical scholar. He's got a PhD in New Testament scholarship. And he says the way you should interpret any piece of literature is ask, what did the original author intend? I don't think the original author of Genesis intended to say general relativity applies, that there are different times, And so that's why I struggle with that possible interpretation. But God could have meant that. Who knows? But that is true. Time is relative. It depends on both how close you are to an object with mass, the gravitational field, and it has to do with how fast you're going. I can slow time down by going near the speed of light. So it's really a fascinating thing. Time seems to be unchangeable, but it's highly malleable. Yeah.
I might have missed this last night, but could you spend a couple minutes talking about your reason behind the Big Bang Theory and God explaining the Big Bang Theory biblically?
Well, I haven't talked about it biblically at all.
Okay.
Last night I gave evidence for the Big Bang from a scientific point of view, but that was the purpose of this. I don't know how much time to spend on my understanding of Genesis 1, because we have 6 days of creation. What does that mean? Is that something that people would like to hear from an older creation viewpoint, how you interpret the 6 days? So there's a couple nods. All right, so I'll give you a little bit of time. So let's go through Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Let's take it at face value. God made the heavens and the earth. From the Big Bang perspective, that takes 9 billion years. So there's 9 billion years in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the surface of the earth. We've all of a sudden focused from the universe, 9 billion years of creation, to the earth. Why? Because God's going to prepare a place for humans. So now, verse 2 starts 4.5 billion years ago. And notice what verse 2 says. Verse 2 is the key verse, but most people just skip over it. It says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the surface of the earth. It is not talking about the universe as a whole anymore. It's talking only about the earth. It says the earth itself doesn't have any form yet. It's not completely formed, and it's void, which means it doesn't have any life on it. And it's dark where? On the surface of the deep, on the surface of the earth. Most people think that it's dark everywhere, but that's not what the Bible says. So if you were to transport yourself to the earth 4.5 billion years ago, and you want to describe what it looks like on the surface of the earth 4.5 billion years ago, you would exactly describe it like that. It's without form and void, there's no life, it's still forming, and it's dark on the surface. The reason it's dark is because the earth was formed from interplanetary meteors, dust, debris. And after the earth is just formed, there's still a lot of interplanetary stuff out there. So the sun is shining, you just can't see it from the surface of the earth. On the surface of the earth, it's dark. I have a friend who was an atheist, and he read Genesis 1 and 2. And he said, this is amazing. How did the author of Genesis know what the early earth was like? No one was there 4.5 billion years ago. But it would have been formless and void and dark. That was enough for him to say there must be something special about the Bible as an atheist. So most people miss that. They say, well, why is the sun created on day 4? Well, it doesn't say the sun's created on day 4. Because we're talking about what you would see on the surface of the earth. Why is the universe dark? It doesn't say the universe is dark. It says the surface of the earth is dark. And that's exactly what you would see from the surface of the earth 4.5 billion years ago. So now the whole story is told from the surface of the earth. Verse 3, the Spirit of God is brooding over the surface of the waters. The first thing that God says is, let there be light. So if you were on the surface of the Earth 4 billion years ago, it would have been totally dark because of all this debris in the atmosphere and in interplanetary space. And as that debris began to settle, the first thing you would see is light and dark. You still can't see the sun and the moon and the stars. It's like a cloudy day. But you can tell now when it's light and when it's dark. Whereas before that, you would not have been able to tell. Even though the Earth is rotating, you can't see any light or dark. It's always dark because of the debris. But as the debris cleans up, you begin to see light and dark. And so the first thing that would happen on the surface of the Earth is I would know that it's day and night. I still can't see the stars and the moon and the sun because there's too much debris. But like a cloudy day, I know when it's light and when it's dark. Then the second thing, so that's day one. On day two, God creates the waters above and the waters below. In other words, you start to get a water cycle. Oh, by the way, the early Earth was a water world too. When it talks about the Spirit of God moving over the surface of the deep or the surface of the waters, that is the early Earth. There basically is no land. It's almost all water. So how did the writer know that? So on day two, you have the water cycle. You separate the waters above from the waters below. That's clouds and oceans. That's the next thing that happens in the early Earth. A water cycle begins to develop. You have evaporation, you have rain, you have water cycle. Day four, or day three, you get the dry land and plants appear. So I was once reading a book, in fact, it's the book I talked about last night, Rare Earth. And they had a plot here of the time of the Earth. So here's 0, here's 4.5 billion years later. This is where we are now. And they had the amount of land on the Earth. So 0% to 100%. And what they mean by 100% is what we have today, which is 1/3. And it looked like this. For the first 1.5 billion years, there's hardly any land on the Earth. And then all of a sudden it shoots up like this, and then it kind of goes like this. And I looked at that with astonishment, because the Bible says that up until day 3, days 1 and 2, the Earth is basically a water world. And on day 3, God says, let the dry land appear, and the continents formed. And I looked at this in a secular book, and I said, they just told me when day 3 was, because that's when the continents formed. Right? And so day 4, God says, let the lights in the heavens appear. And it does say that. It says appear, not let them be created, but let them appear. And in fact, ancient Hebrew doesn't have a past tense like we have. It has what's called a completed tense. Action has already completed. And in day 4 it says the verb is in that tense. God had already made the sun and the moon and the stars, but they appear on day 4. And so finally on day 4, the debris in the atmosphere clears up enough that you can actually see the sun and the moon and the stars. I mean, they had been out there all along, but you just wouldn't have been able to see them. So this explains the mystery of how light's created on day 1, but the sun and the moon and stars aren't created until day 4. It's not that they're actually created that day, it's that from the surface of the Earth, you don't see them on a regular basis till the debris clears, and that happens about day 4. On day 5, God makes sea creatures and birds, and then on day 6, God finally makes what are called the nephesh animals. That's a specific Hebrew word. It has a couple meanings, like every Hebrew word, but one of its meanings it literally means soulish. It's the animals that interact with humans. It's not all animals, but the word is nephesh. It can mean life-ish or soulish, and so it's like your dogs or your higher mammals. And so there's 10 creation events in Genesis 1. If you take that story as told from the surface of the Earth, those 10 events are in the exact order that modern science says they should be. So again, this atheist friend of mine who was a non-believer read Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. He was shocked that Genesis got the initial conditions of the Earth right. He read the rest of the story. He was shocked that any writer could get the 10 events in the correct order, but they did. And so that's a brief overview of one of the interpretations of Genesis in this view. And then the days of creation are long periods of time. It fits perfect. And everybody skips over verse 2. But verse 2 tells what perspective am I telling the story from? It's on the surface of the waters where the Spirit of God is. And then everything you see is what you would see on the earth, watching it form so that humans can live on it. So that's a brief overview. That's my best interpretation of Genesis. There are about 3 or 4 others that I hold as in really high regard that could be true. I like the day, this is called the day-age theory. I like the day-age theory because it fits so well with science. It may not be true, but it fits well with what I believe, so I kind of like it. Okay.
What are the other theories?
One is called the analogical days, that the 6 days of creation are just analogs to our days. They really don't mean anything as far, they're God's days. One is called the framework hypothesis, and no matter what you believe, the framework is certainly true. So the framework says that the earth is formless and void, and that's a problem. Okay? So in the let me give you the big picture. In the framework hypothesis, the days have no meaning at all except like an outline. So day 1 is like 0.1, and day 2 is like 0.2, and day 3 is like 0.3, and that's all they mean. This is called the framework hypothesis. And in this, you see, you've got a problem that it's formless and it's void. Okay? So each of the first 3 days take care of the formless part. So here God creates light. Here he fills the void with the lights in the heaven. Okay? Here God creates sky and sea. And here he fills it with fish and birds. And here God creates land, and he fills it with animals. Okay? So the idea is that the days are never meant to be 24 hours. This story was probably oral tradition for thousands of years, if you believe in an old earth. And this is a great mnemonic to remember it. And it's written in a semi-poetic way, like it's meant to be recited. And so this idea is that the days don't have any actual period of time or chronology. That it's a way to tell the story of God preparing the earth for humans, with the earth being formless and void, and he takes care of those 2 things. I think no matter what else you believe, this is certainly true. That pattern is there. Whether it's the only reason for the 6 days, I think, is debatable. The time being one is another one. Of course, the fact that there's 6 24-hour days is a possibility. That's another one. And there, again, you can go online and ask for the PCA report on creation and find they have 4 major views and like 10 minor views. And the major views, I think, are framework, analogical, day age, and literal 24 hours. But the point is, I don't want to be critical or dogmatic. For those of you who have heard this is the only view, I just do not believe that's biblically true. Again, I could be totally wrong that these may not be right. But if you're hung up because you've been taught, if you believe the Bible, you believe this, there's just way too many people who really believe the Bible who don't believe that don't get hung up on that.
I have a question that also comes sometimes in conflict when we discuss with an atheist person.
Okay.
Like it is, for instance, did it really happen a flood that enveloped all the earth
Right.
in the times of Noah?
Right, so the question about the flood is another question. Most young earth, that is something that's different. Most young earth creationists believe the flood covered the whole earth, that all the evidence for erosion and all that we see, all the fossil record is called by the flood. Most people in these 2 camps have a different view of the flood. They certainly don't believe it's worldwide. Most people in the older progressionist camp believe that the flood, what's the purpose of the flood? To wipe out all of sin and all of humans. So the flood only has to cover where humans have been. It doesn't have to cover the whole world. And so it has to be, in one person's words, universal but not global. So most old earth creationists believe the flood is universal but not global. It covers everything that humans have touched, but it's still probably contained to where humans are, maybe the Mesopotamian Valley or something. Now you may ask, but what about the language? The language of Genesis for the flood seems to indicate that it covers the highest mountains and all this. But again, you have to understand culture. Nebuchadnezzar said he was king over all the world. Now Nebuchadnezzar knew there were parts of Europe he wasn't king over. When he says, I'm king over all the world, he doesn't mean how we would say it. he means everything I'm familiar with that I care about. Paul says, I preach the gospel to the entire world. But then the next sentence, Paul says, I can't wait to get to Spain to preach the gospel. Right? So when Paul says, I preach the gospel to the whole world, everything, he doesn't mean the way we would think of the whole world. And so when the language of the flood says it's covered the whole world, if you look at it in, again, how language and culture is used of that day, it's not 21st century Western world. They mean pretty much everything I know. And if you're sitting on that ark and you see nothing but water, you say it's covered the whole world, no matter how big it is, as long as it's covered everything you know. And so if you understand how this superlative language is used by all the ancients, again, go look in the Bible. It's how Nebuchadnezzar uses it. It's how Paul uses it. It's how people talked back then. You did not mean the entire globe when you say, I'm king over the whole world. And so the flood doesn't have to be over the whole world to be described as it is in Genesis. But it does have to be universal enough that it does God's purpose, which is to destroy mankind. So most people here would say the flood destroyed all of humans, but was local, not global. A lot of people here would even struggle more. They would probably say the flood didn't even destroy all humans, just all people near where the flood was. So that would be a little bit of a contention.
But there is big scientific evidence that there was a big flood.
There is no scientific evidence there was ever a worldwide flood.
No, but the big flood.
There are lots of evidences for big floods.
Like the diluvial periods?
Nobody knows when or where the flood of Noah was. There's not any evidence that there was a singular event that would easily fit into the chronology of the flood of Noah. So it's uncertain. But there's certainly, I have lots of friends who are Christians, good Christians who are geologists, and they continually talk to me about the lack of evidence for a truly global flood. Again, I can be wrong. I don't know everything. I'm telling you the best information I have from the best sources I can get. And when I get to heaven, I'm going to be wrong about certain things. This could be one of them. But these ideas are not anti-biblical. They are certainly within the realm of what the Bible says, even if you take the Bible as I do, as absolutely true in everything it talks about. Yeah?
Going off that question, in Genesis 6, when it talks about how the floodgates of heaven were open, is it possible, do some older creationists possibly believe that means that, in a way, God returned Earth to its original state where it was covered in water?
Yeah, no, there's not enough water to cover the whole Earth once you have continents. This is a big problem with global flood. You take they have to basically flatten all the mountains or do something. There is not enough water on the Earth to cover the Earth. And so the young Earth creationist has to go through a lot of gymnastics to try to get it to cover the Earth, including bringing all the mountains to extremely small sizes. So the young Earth creation has a problem, like to form the Himalayas after the flood would create so much tectonic activity that we wouldn't be around. It would have wiped out humanity. But they say God did it somehow. Well, God could do that. I don't know. But when you start to ask if there really was a flood that covered the whole Earth 4,000 years ago and that the Earth was smooth enough to allow the water to cover that, how would you get to the Earth you have now, including the diversity of animal life you see? It becomes really, really challenging. I talked to a young Earth creationist once and I said, you realize that if you have one prototypical cat on the ark, and you have to come up with all the cat species after that, then after the flood, you would have to, what we call, have hyper-evolution. Evolution would have to happen so quick to see all the cat species that we have now. And his answer was, yeah, that's what God did. So they don't believe in evolution, but they do believe in hyper-evolution when you need it. Right. Again, it doesn't change species. It's still within the cat family. That's his point. There was like one cat family on the ark, and all the cats came from it. But the change in the genome of the cats to give all that we have now would have happened so fast that no evolutionist thinks change happens that quick. So there are real problems when you try to get to the details of the young Earth creation paradigm. And the answer is always, well, this is how God did it. He can do it that way. And my answer is yes, God could do it that way.
Can I comment on that? I mean, all the dog species between Chihuahua and Great Dane have been created within 200 years. So that's not a problem. But I mean, I don't know.
No, but I mean leopards and tigers,
Right.
and I mean all the cat family,
Right.
not just domesticated
That's
cats.
not, I don't want to
Yeah,
go into details
okay.
here. I have some other big question. Okay, so you have these 3 columns under the 4th one. And why are those important? Obviously, one of those or somewhere in between is the truth.
Right.
We haven't figured it out yet.
Right.
But is it important or not? I mean, it seems to me that if you are too far out in the right in these 3 columns, maybe there is a threat that you fall off the deep end.
Well, that's the question. Is there a threat that you fall this way?
Yeah.
So I was here 30 years ago. I've been here for 30 years. I'm not going to fall off the right. Somebody at a very meeting like this last week asked me, so you changed from this to this 30 years ago. Have you changed anything else you believe? My answer is no. It's not a slippery slope to disregard what you believe. Because it's just not. You can be totally true to the Bible and believe either of these columns. So I think this is just not a reality for most people. It isn't a slope this way. Why does it matter? That's a great question. For some people, it doesn't. My mom, I talk about this, and she goes to sleep, you know. To her, it doesn't matter. God created the world. I don't care how you did it. And if that's where you are, that's great. To other people, there's a huge stumbling block. I've had students walk into my office literally and say, this is what I was taught in church as the only biblical view. I now am at OU, I'm being taught this, and I'm seeing all the evidence for this. And it's a crisis of their faith. They say, if God said this, and this is true, then how can I believe in God? And I've had students say, I'm ready to give up my Christian faith because this is a huge stumbling block. For them, it's important. For them, they need to know you can live your life here and be a follower of Christ. You know, whether or not this is true, you can live your life here and be a follower of Christ. Is this important for everybody? No. Is it a huge stumbling block for some people? Yes. And so it's important for us to be equipped enough to be able to say to those in which this is a stumbling block, here are some of your options. You don't have to fall into just one of these categories and be a follower of Christ. We don't know the truth, you're right. And somewhere along this continuum is the truth. I don't know what it is. My best guess is was once here, it's now here, someday it may be here. I don't know, as evidence comes in. But what I do know is it's irrelevant to whether the Bible is true or not, and it's irrelevant to whether or not I can be a follower of Christ. And that's the real message, right? It's that we need to make this an irrelevant subject so that people can come to Christ without feeling like they have to give up, you know, their mind. They can't love the Lord their God, their mind, or that there's stumbling blocks that prevent them from coming to Christ. And that, to me, is why it's important for me, because I have students after students who this is a huge stumbling block to them being able to follow Jesus. Yeah?
This is the first time I've come to one of your talks. Can you give us a quick rundown of kind of your history, how you got to this point, what you're doing now? Because you mentioned OU.
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian family. My dad was actually a pastor, so I was taught that the stories of the Bible were true. I always asked the why questions. So I began to investigate whether or not Christianity was true. I would say, kind of even as an intellectual person, as a sophomore in high school. I was taught, you know, that this is what the Bible said. I'm a physics professor at OU. I do research at the Large Hadron Collider studying the smallest particles of matter. Over the course of some years in my 20s, I changed from this to this based on both my biblical studies and my scientific studies. Like any follower of Christ, I have days when he seems real to me and days when he seems distant, right? And sometimes this objective evidence I've talked about is really comforting on those days he seems distant. Yeah, so I don't know if you have other specific questions. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What evidence is lacking to talking about?
Well, this is what I said last night. The mechanisms for evolution, random mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, to me are not compelling enough to create the information that I see in DNA and the complexity of information. Even when I sit down with microbiologists who believe in evolution and they explain it to me, as a physicist, and I grant that that's a specific way of viewing the world, as a physicist, I don't see enough scientific compelling evidence for the mechanisms. Now, I've had people to say to me, the circumstantial evidence for evolution is so strong that they believe in it, even though they're not convinced the mechanisms we propose yet work. But I go the other way around. Until I see the mechanism that works, I have trouble believing the circumstantial evidence. I once sat down with a woman at OU who's a microbiologist she's known for being anti-Christian. And she knew I was a Christian. And I wrote her an email. I said, sometimes when I give talks and people ask me about evolution, and I say I don't necessarily believe it's true, sometimes I get people in the life science fields who are critical of me. They say, well, he must not understand evolution. So I said to this woman at OU who's a great professor, she does great evolutionary biology, can we just have lunch so I can make sure I understand evolution, so that I don't not believe it because I don't understand it, I don't believe it because I don't get the mechanism. And so we had lunch, great conversation. She explained evolution, evidence after evolutionary evidence. And evolutionists don't make a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. To someone who believes in evolution, macroevolution is simply microevolution over time. So Christians make this big distinction between micro and macro. You won't see that in an evolutionist. So to someone who believes in evolution, every time you see evidence for microevolution, a small change within a population, that to them is evidence for macroevolution. So I started with that. I said to this professor, I understand that macroevolution is just microevolution over time, but I still have trouble making that leap. So it's funny, as our conversation progressed, by the end of the lunch, she started every single piece of evidence with this statement. Now I know this won't change your mind, but, and she'd give me another piece of evidence for microevolution. And that's what the evidence for evolution is. It's evidence for microevolution. Now, if macroevolution is just microevolution over time, then the mechanism works. This, again, you're hearing this from a physicist. So how much do I know about evolution? Who knows? But if macroevolution is simply microevolution over time, then the evidence works. If it's not, if it takes something extra to create new functionality and new information, then I don't think we have a mechanism. So, if tomorrow a microbiologist stumbled upon something that just showed that you can, through natural processes, develop the information within the DNA, that you can take multiple steps of genome change, and every step is positive, and you can produce new functionality, then I would change. Because that's what evolution supposedly does. I have a lot of good, knowledgeable scientist Christian friends who believe this is true. Some people want to equate Big Bang with evolution. They're two entirely different things. And I have a lot of my friends who are extremely educated in the sciences who believe the evidence for evolution is inadequate and may always be inadequate. So they believe that when you see new life in the fossil record, including human life, God supernaturally created it, but that the universe is still old. So those are two very separate questions, and they have to be answered with very separate lines of evidence. But again, I have lots of friends who live in this world who are great Christians who believe God used a natural process to create our human bodies. So here's a question. If I lived in this camp, I'd say this. Well, every one of your human bodies was created through a natural process, right? If you don't know how, come ask me afterwards. We'll talk about it, all right? But every one of your human bodies was created through a natural process. Couldn't God make the first human bodies through a natural process? Does that make him any less God? Of course not. See, it's irrelevant how God made these human bodies. In fact, when you read about God's interaction in nature, I love reading what the Bible says about how we should see God in nature. We tend to think we see God in nature when Jesus calms a storm, or when Jesus turns water into wine, or when Jesus raises the dead, when he does these miracles. But most of the way we're supposed to see God in nature is not through miracles, but through natural processes. In Psalm 19, we see God because the sun rises. God has said he takes responsibility for feeding the lions. We should see God when the lions are fed. Well, ancient people knew how the lions are fed. That's why they avoided the lions. They're not saying that God supernaturally feeds the lions. And so mostly we see God in how wonderful the universe works. That's what I explained last night. And so if the mechanism of evolution works wonderfully, then we should see God in it. But again, as a skeptical scientist, I just don't yet see the scientific evidence for it. I say that if, like I said last night, if my physics students brought in the same kind of stories I read that support evolution, and that was what they wrote for their PhD dissertation in physics, they wouldn't get a PhD. But again, it's two different sciences. Those who work in this field are really convinced it happened. It may be true. It doesn't matter. Huh?
You should see economics.
Yeah, right. I'd have trouble. Yeah. All right, let's see. What do we got? All right.
Just a bit of a joke, but did you just say that physics is the ultimate premier best science?
Absolutely. There's no question. That's not a joke, right? Yeah. I also said I'm biased. Yes.
Going a little bit to the time scales, can we say that the only difference between this young Earth versus the old and the theist is basically an scale factor?
Yeah.
With all the things happening the same way.
Yeah. To naturalistic evolutionists, it doesn't matter when this was. You know, is this 4,000 years ago? Is it 13.7 billion? It doesn't matter. It's equally problematic. Right? And this is a minor difference between an infinite universe that these guys would like, right? With no beginning. I mean, the big difference is the top column. And we as Christians need to keep that in mind and quit fighting over this. Some of us are going to be wrong. If it's not me, it'll be you, or someone's going to be wrong. And we'll find out when we get to heaven, and let's not fight over it. Let's focus on the bigger issues. Because again, people who believe all these believe the same thing about what the Bible is. It's God's Word. Yeah, last question, and then we'll stop.
Kind of different topic, but maybe they're related. Do you have any interesting thoughts on how your physics background relates to more modern, as far as Jesus times or miracles, or just any interesting thoughts on that we might find interesting?
Yeah. So. Do I have any interesting thoughts? My wife would say no, right there. Right? That's an easy one. I think, so
very broad.
Miracles are an interesting question. So I think as a physicist, I am more easily accept miracles. Okay? Here's why. God is transcendent. So what does it mean to be transcendent? Well, we really can't tell. So in 1884, I might be off by a few years, 1889, a guy named Edwin Abbott wrote a book called Flatland. And it's even been discussed on the Big Bang Theory TV show. So you should definitely know about this, all right? So in Flatland, there's a race of people that live on a piece of paper, where they live in a flat two-dimensional world. And I, as a three-dimensional being, try to explain myself to the two-dimensional people. And they can't understand it. As much as I try to explain it, they can't understand it. And it helps me realize that if God is outside my dimensions of space and time, I can't understand him. But talk about miracles for a second, all right? So, don't I have a pen? So I'll show you this in a second. There's a Flatland person, and he lives inside a house, right? So there's the person, he's a dot, and the walls are a house. And this person can't get out. It's a prison maybe. There's no door, right? This person can't leave the prison because there's a wall all around him. But me, as being in three dimensions, I can go from here to here, right? Just like this. It's not a prison for me. So I can appear to walk through the walls from this guy's viewpoint because I come into this dimension and then I go back in to his dimension. So to me, as a spacelander, is what Edwin Abbott calls it, what looks like a miracle is trivial. To me, it's trivial. I just go from here to here. To him, it's a miracle. I first appeared here, and then I appeared here. How did I do that? I got through the wall. And so, to me, miracles become trivial for a transcendent God. And I think I understand that better as a scientist because I can think about the idea of extra dimensions and what that might look like. And so, things that seem really hard for God, if he's transcendent, if he doesn't live on Flatland but lives in Spaceland, things that seem really hard to me become trivial for God. And that helps me in my walk with him because there are a lot of things in my life that I would say, these are really hard. What are we going to do about this? And God says, You stupid flatlander. Is that all you see? You know, I live outside of that little flatland, so expand your vision of who I am. Miracles are trivia. And I think that helps me in my walk with God. So thank you for your interest. It's been wonderful. You want to say a few things? Or?
Yeah, let's thank Dr. Strauss. Really appreciate you coming and sharing with us. Dr. Strauss has a lecture of the physics department. He can hang around for a few minutes, I'm guessing, to talk if anybody has any questions, and then we'll have to head over that direction. So he doesn't have very long, so please be aware of that. And